welcome everyone, one and all, to Impolite Company on the WGCPR.live network, where we defy the old adage and dive headfirst into religion and politics. I'm your host, Matthew Best, here to walk with you in honest dialogue and showcase the power of seeing the humanity of people with different perspectives. You can send me your questions and comments to contactimpolitecompany@gmail.com. And you can find previous episodes and sign up to listen to new episodes through popular podcast channels like iHeartRadio, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. Just search for Impolite Company. Look for our logo, which is right behind me. You can see that there. And you can dive further into topics that we talk about on the show by going to my blog at pastormatthewbest.com. And if you enjoy what we're doing here and you want to be supportive of the show, and we ask you please do that, you can go to buymeacoffee.com/impolite company. And before we dive into today's episode, I want to take a moment of some personal privilege to share a couple of things I care passionately about. The first, of course, as I talk about often, you can show some love to Christ Lutheran Church in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, in the heart of Allison Hill. It's the church I am called to serve as pastor. Christ Lutheran is a special place of community and of healing, which and what makes this church special is that we host 3 free health clinics that have over 100,000 visits since 2018. You can find out more. You can offer your support by going to christharrisburg.org. Let me just take care of something as I keep going in this. And if you care about homelessness, check out Memorial Blanket Project. Each year, people make blankets for strangers, and we make an art installation to highlight homelessness and then give them away at the end of the night. We've done this in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, on the front lawn of the U.S. Capitol, last year on the steps of the PA Capitol. This year, we're going to be at the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia, and you can help if you go to memorialblanket.org. Lastly, if you are looking for a tool to help with conversations on the difficult topic of gun violence while seeing the humanity of others, check out American Roulette. It's a unique novel that highlights the humanity of the victims, the community, and even the perpetrator while offering no solutions, just conversation. All proceeds of the book go to organizations that address gun violence. So I've got a guest who was on, and here he comes. All right, let's see. This is how it works. All right, and they're right on time, Silas, which is really great.
Ready for my dramatic entrance.
Yeah, that's right. A dramatic entrance. I just went through my whole introduction and I'm like, all right, I think he's going to come back. I'm sure he's going to come back. And so today I am pleased to welcome Silas Kulkarni to the show. He's here in his personal capacity, not in his professional position with the churchwide organization. So he works in faith-based political advocacy in both Congress and the executive branch. Silas brings a passion for social and racial justice that is deeply connected to his faith and past work. Earlier in his career, Silas worked as a teacher in low-income communities and a grassroots organizer. He also founded and was executive director of an education equity nonprofit. More recently, he served as a senior fellow for public discourse at the grassroots depolarization organization Braver Angels, which we're going to talk about as we go through this, helping facilitate productive conversations between conservatives and progressives. And he strives to bring this spirit of willingness to engage with politically and culturally diverse communities to his faith life and political work. Lives in D.C. with his 2 young children and his wife, who is an ELCA pastor, who I had the privilege of knowing a little bit in seminary. So it is great. Thank you so much for taking some time to be on the show, Silas.
Hey, well, it's a pleasure to be here, Matthew. And I'm really just honored to be a part of this conversation. I'm almost certain that I'll say something I regret at some point, so I'm glad I'm not here in my official professional capacity, but
right.
happy to share my opinions with you.
That's good. That's good. Yeah, right. Yeah, as you were saying, it's on the internet, so it's permanent now, right? It's even more permanent than if it was etched in stone. Stone wears away, internet is forever, right? Anyway, so let's dive in to this post-election world. Here we are. It's a couple weeks after the election. It was extremely divisive election that, and we're still. I think there's still a lot of I guess the best way to describe it, heavy feelings
Mm.
that people have. I think there's a lot of folks who are glad the ads are done, and all there's a sense of relief in that. There's a sense of relief in this, in the idea of it seems like there's going to be a smooth transition of power. But there's still a lot of tension. There's a lot of can I trust people? All this type of stuff. When you're encountering folks from across the country or wherever, and you're talking with people, what are you encountering with people? What are they feeling?
Well, I mean, I want to be honest about the bubble I live in because
Yeah,
I have I have a lot of friends who are politically disagreeing with each other, but I live very much in a metropolitan bubble. And so, I grew up in Houston, Texas, big city. I now live in Washington, D.C., both a big city and very much a mid-Atlantic East Coast kind of city. Most of my friends I knew from college or a circle that was connected to college, which means they're college educated, which means that they probably landed in a big city, these kind of things. So I just want to be honest that there's a bubble that I'm in where I think a lot of the people, though there are people of politically diverse opinions, the overwhelming bulk are people who would have voted Democrat. That's certainly true in Washington, D.C. And so there's just an incredible amount of grief, fear, anxiety, and kind of confusion. I think a lot of confusion. I do have a number of friends. I guess maybe I'm lucky in this regard, and certainly family members. If I go a little bit broader than just the people I know by choice, but the ones who I was born into, who voted for Trump, who support Trump, and I spend a lot of time just talking to people who aren't necessarily close relations of mine, and so I
yeah,
can't get as deep a window into the emotional life of those people because they're not as likely to share. But among people I know who were Trump supporters, a lot of them expressed a relief. A lot of them expressed a just happiness or like I don't have many friends who are in the like camp of just like I guess the polar inverse, like deeply committed Trump voters who would just
sure.
like dance for joy, but I know that that's out there. So,
Yeah,
I think there's almost like these inverse feelings across the board. And then there's a
right.
lot of people who I've met, including people I just talked to on the street corner, who are shoulder shrugging about it.
Yeah,
Like I talked to the FedEx delivery man at my office. Just I've been asking just regular people how they're feeling, and
yeah, yeah,
especially focusing on working class people, which I'll get to later in the conversation. But and he's a young African American man delivering for FedEx, and just asked him what he thought, and he's like, honestly, it doesn't make much difference to me. I try and keep
mm,
my head down. I'm a kind of wishy-washy between the two of them. You know what? It just seemed like my life is my life, and
yeah,
um, so I think that the country runs that spectrum, and I think
right.
there's a lot of people who are, in particular, are within certain subcommunities incredibly afraid, and so
Yeah,
like I know members of my family who are queer people in very red states and other friends and friends and friends who are in that situation who are very concerned about their marriage, whether it will be made illegal, about whether they're going to get harassed more, like and likewise people who are in immigrant families, including mixed status families, like that's a really really big fear for people. And then people who are politically active are worried that they're going to get targeted. So there's fear there. But that's a whole spectrum, a whole
yeah,
spectrum.
right. Absolutely. Yeah, there's a whole lot to talk about with that.
Mm. Yeah.
So when we were talking a couple of weeks ago on the phone, talking about what we were going to talk about, you had mentioned about there's a whole lot of analyzing that's been going on, right? And I find I have not really been watching the analyzing because I think it would drive me insane. Because oh, it's people voted this way because of this, and it's like, oh, this
Mhm.
is the one thing, or they voted this way because of this.
Hmm.
And then there's, a multitude of 20,000 others that these folks think that they all have the answer to why somebody votes. And there's a whole range, right? I mean, it's,
Hmm.
and that's a bad assumption that politics is rational.
Hmm.
Oftentimes it's not rational at all. Like there's a certain percentage that if you're at the top of the ticket, you're going to get like an extra 1% or something like that. Like that's not
Hmm.
rational, but that's how some people vote.
Hmm. Hmm.
So it's not easy to discern what's accurate and what's not. I mean, this is part of the larger picture, right? Of misinformation and all this type of stuff widespread. So here's my question is how do we discern what's an accurate assessment of election results or even just anything versus what we're feeling? What are your thoughts on that?
It's a great question. So the first thing I would say is if at the end of this election, when you see the outcome, it makes you believe that you were right all along about whatever you thought, probably you are not right.
Yeah, right.
Um, and just to be frank about it, most election narratives that people are putting out there, whether from the right or left that I've heard, are just literally a confirmation of their pre-existing
Yeah,
viewpoints. I've heard people on the
yeah,
right say this is because America is so opposed to, wokeness
right.
and the Biden and the terrible Biden and economy, which was literally their campaign talking points. It was like the same thing. And then
Yep,
I've heard Democrats be like, this is because of racism, misogyny, and how badly those are affecting us. And that's literally what they were saying beforehand. So you
right,
have to just ask yourself, well, let's look at some evidence besides what we thought beforehand.
right.
Let's open our minds. Like I think that people I know who are most insightful about almost any topic are the ones who actively seek out information which disproves or at least contradicts what they assume or what
Yeah.
they want to believe. Because we're great at finding information that confirms what we believe.
Oh
Confirmation
yeah.
bias is an incredibly strong force in our
Oh
minds.
yeah.
We're very bad at seeking, finding, and certainly at integrating and uh, reflecting on information that would contradict our
Of course.
pre-existing notions. So that would be my first advice to anybody. My second advice is that data matters,
Yeah.
and so this is actually something I want to get into deeper about, and you can tell me if you want to go
Yeah.
this direction with the conversation,
Yeah.
Matthew. But um, you know, having spent, as I said, more time in bubbles that lean progressive, and tried actively to overcome that bubbling as both for moral reasons and for knowledge reasons.
Yeah.
um, and by the way, not identifying as progressive myself, I've never identified as progressive, nor do I now. And often I feel a bit alienated by progressivism, even though I wouldn't say I identify as conservative or right wing either.
Hmm.
Um, one thing that I've noticed in the progressive space I've been in is how quickly the narrative has been written that this was about racism and misogyny.
Hmm.
Uh, and of the narratives that are out there, that is probably one of the most easily disprovable ones.
Okay.
Um, and um, and the fact that people are not even bothering to pay attention to some of the most glaring data of this election cycle on that point really concerns me.
Yeah.
Because if that is true, it's a much more depressing story.
Oh yeah.
People who are listening to the podcast can't tell, but I'm a person of color. I'm from an immigrant background. My father was an immigrant. I'm mixed race. I grew up in Houston, Texas, in a time when neither of those things was particularly welcome. I've experienced a lot of very straightforward racism in my life.
Yeah.
Just
Yeah.
yelling racial slurs, threatening to beat you up, like just I would never date somebody of your group, like
Yeah.
just the straightforward stuff, not like any
Hmm.
ambiguity. And that's actually, as you said in my bio, been a driving passion of mine throughout my life is racial justice.
Right.
Um, but it's very troubling to me if people say, "Oh, this is a sign that racism is going to rule the day in America." That makes me feel worse. If that is true, that makes me feel a lot worse about the country I live in. It makes me feel a lot
Sure.
worse about where things are going. And the data suggests the exact opposite. So I want to get into this point a little bit because um, I'm not going to claim that this data is definitive yet because
Sure.
exit polling has a lot of unreliability to it. But from what you can see by county data, which is far more reliable than exit polling data, the story is confirmed, and what I've heard from my own interactions with everyday people, this is also confirmed. Trump did not win because white people turned out more strongly for him. White people swung in his direction. He won because people of color swung in his direction,
Right.
and in large numbers, and coming especially from the working class.
Right.
And if you look at this, there's an article that I would really recommend to anybody here who is interested to find something that may contradict a prior notion and had that prior notion. And we can get to the other prior notions that people had.
Yeah. Yeah.
But if you want it, there's a great article called "A Graveyard of Bad Election Narratives."
Okay.
A Graveyard of Bad Election Narratives by a writer named Musa Al-Garbi. He's a interesting person, very interesting person. Columbia professor, actually, but from a very non-traditional background for that outcome.
Okay.
He was selling shoes before he got into grad school at Columbia for a number of years.
Wow.
Like, you know,
Wow.
he comes from
Okay.
a much more working class background, military in a small town in Arizona.
Yeah.
Um, so if you just Google "A Graveyard of Bad Election Narratives," it's a Substack article. I highly recommend it because it's very data driven and just goes one by one by what you'll hear pundits saying and how they just don't seem to be true. And on this point about people of color, I just want anybody who's progressive and is talking about how we're doomed because of racism to just like take a look at these data, because between 2016 and 2024, there's been 3 elections where Donald Trump has run.
Yeah.
He has gained double digits both times with Latinos and Latinas, by the way.
Uh-huh.
So from the data available right now, from his 2016 race to now, he is fully 22 points better on the spread with Latinas than he was against Clinton in 2016. Okay, with Latino men, it's a slightly less strong improvement over that time period. Okay, so the idea that this is driven by people of color, turns out he did better with black women and men.
Yeah.
Turns out he did better with Asian women and men. And so the only group that Trump actually did worse with is actually white people.
Yeah.
So that is something that people ought to just pay some close attention to
Yeah.
before they interpret this narrative the way it is. And that is not to say that I think there are things that he said that are just objectively, unambiguously
Right.
racist. I think there's plenty of policies that I would argue are very racist.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think that's ambiguous to me when you just say some of the things that he says. And again, to those debates with my conservative friends all the time, I don't know what the bar is that would define something that way.
Right.
But to say that what's happening here is white people are being motivated by racism, either you can say that people of color, of every color, are being extremely motivated by racism, while white people are feeling kind of lukewarm on racism,
Interesting.
or which is a very implausible narrative from my
Right.
perspective. Or you'd have to say, actually, something else is driving people's votes here.
Yeah.
And likewise, the second one, sexism. Now, there was some very overt, unambiguous sexism at play in this race.
Right.
Not small. And, for people I know who did phone calling, I know lots of people who did phone calling volunteering, and frankly, in many directions, including RFK direction. And for the people I know, many people just heard somebody on the phone who said, "I'm not going to vote for a woman." That's a thing people actually said. So
Oh, sure.
to deny that is sexism, I think that's kind of crazy. I think that's obvious, overt, straightforward sexism.
Right.
But if you're trying to explain the overall result that way, you would have to notice that Trump gained more with women than he did with men.
Yeah.
Like he specifically from Biden in 2020 to Harris in 2024, women went 7 more points toward Trump this time. Men went 5 more points. He gained more with women than men.
Wow.
So and you could make the case that internalized racism, internalized sexism is actually a bigger driving force, and somehow that's a really convoluted case.
Yeah,
Um,
sure.
Unless, especially when you just look at the shifts across the board, they are exactly that across the board. Almost every county in the country shifted in that direction.
Yeah.
Almost every demographic you can look at shifted in that direction. So I'm just really hesitant to affirm these kind of pre-existing narratives, and I just am very troubled by getting into spaces of people very presumably very concerned about racism, sexism, etc., and jumping straight to a picture of the world that is just literally in contrast with the behavior of the people purported to be represented. And I say that from a perspective of somebody who's fought my whole life for social justice
Yeah, sure.
as I've understood it.
Well, I
And cares very passionate about both racial social justice and
right.
uh, gender-based social justice.
Well, and this kind of reminds me of the reality that there are very few people who are one issue voters, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's definitely a segment of the population that they have one issue. This is what they're going to vote on. Typically, this will fall into like abortion is oftentimes ends up being a one issue voter type of thing. And so that's what they're paying attention to, and that's what they're voting on, and anything else doesn't matter. But the vast majority of people are not one issue voters, or it's not, I'm only going to find out about this one issue, and that's the only thing that matters. But generally, they have, this is where it gets really complicated, right? Because you've got people who may or may not have heard the things that Trump had said, and may not have liked those things, and may have thought, well, that's terrible. However, they also then identified on something else that was more important for them in their assessment of whatever it is that they're looking at, and they determined, well, I'm going to vote this way because of X, Y, and Z, and not because of A, B, and C, whatever the case may be. And then this ends up being the complication is we have so many issues that end up being addressed in a political campaign that it's kind of like how we've gone from having three networks
Mm-hmm.
to having there's a network essentially for every person, and so that makes it really complicated, and people have these whole kind of calculus of how they're going to vote for things, or how they're going to vote in an election, and they have different values, they have different priorities, they have different all this type of stuff, and it makes it much more difficult than to even get to any type of analysis, because you're just kind of muddying it up, and it gets away from all these like common narratives,
Mm-hmm.
right? I mean, this is kind of the big thing is we're in a post meta narrative culture, to use some trendy
Highfalutin
words,
language.
right? But there's not, right. I remember, I forgot who it was, Cal Thomas or somebody like that, who wrote, and he's more on the conservative thing, and this is going back years ago. I remember this from when I was in college in the late 90s. And he talked about it then, of the idea that we don't have a common, essentially, experience as a culture. That's at the beginning of like the internet.
Mm.
And he's like, the most common thing that we have is the Super Bowl. It's
Which
the
itself has
most,
become very polarized now.
right, which is so very polarized, but it was this common experience where nowadays you don't have like the epic movies generally that were back in that the Technicolor days of things, and you don't have just everyone tuning in to Walter Cronkite for the news, and you don't, and people aren't all that type of stuff. So yeah, I think it is really important, the data. I do want to ask you about this, so a little bit different. What are your thoughts about fact checking?
um, well, there's a lot to say about that, so maybe you should be
Yeah.
more specific in your question.
Well, all right.
Do I in
So,
general try to do it? I do try to.
well, so here's where I think oftentimes, like the especially the cable networks, right? They went really all in on fact checking
Mhm,
to convey a message,
mhm,
and honestly, I thought they were wasting their time,
mhm,
because in order for fact checking to have value, there needs to be a shared set of values
mhm,
of what truth is and what matters, and does truth matter, and all those type of things, and even foundational, what I call creedal beliefs. There's a lot of people operating on the belief that the ends justifies the means. Now, I don't agree with that, but if the ends justifies the means, then then fact checking is a waste of time, because that's not the most important thing for somebody who holds that. So that's kind of where I'm coming from.
I mean, I think that there's two things I want to say about fact checking. I guess the first is, or actually three. The first is I myself do my best to check facts before I speak them and share them.
Yeah.
And I am always surprised by what I find,
Yeah.
particularly in the current media climate, because it's so easy to repeat a headline and then go check the fact and see it not to be true. And I want to
Right.
actually name that because in the very article that I shared on Substack, the
Yeah.
graveyard of bad election narratives, I have not had a chance to look at the original data sources there, and that's very laborious. The
Sure.
data is provided there, which is helpful, but going back and tracking, well, is this data source the right data source? He says where it's from, so that is respectable to me.
Yeah.
But more generally, like anytime you're going to make a claim that you have great emotional force behind, spend 10 minutes checking your facts.
Right.
Just do it. Like, I mean, there's so many issues that I care greatly about where this just plays out so unexpectedly differently than you would think. And
Yeah.
you just have like a lot of media sources that just are not bothering to, it's not that they don't do fact checking of a sort, but they don't do narrative fact checking, which is to say,
Yeah.
like, if you claim something is an epidemic, you have a duty more than to say how many instances of it there are. You have a duty to put that in some kind of context that says, what's an epidemic and what's not.
Yeah.
If you say, and by the way, just to be clear, I'm not being a COVID skeptic here. COVID
Right.
was a clear epidemic,
Yeah.
but,
No, I
but
appreciate that.
but I mean, in terms of social epidemics,
Hmm.
um, if you think that everybody is experiencing something the same way, you ought to just and you say like people are saying that so and so is such and such.
Right.
That is not a
Yeah.
like that is a
That's
um,
things we hear, that we pastors hear in churches. People are saying
yeah, that
that,
is
not
hearsay.
helpful. That's
Yeah,
not
not
helpful.
admissible in court. And it's really not helpful to your own thinking if you're trying to get to
Right.
the truth of matters as opposed to be in an in group where
Yeah.
hearsay helps you feel in the green group. But so that's my first point about fact checking is it's important for the average citizen. My second point is when it comes to the major media sources that are available to you, it is hard to find what I would actually call fact checking. In fact, it kind of infuriates me because
Yeah.
like I often read like the Washington Post. I'm living in Washington. I often read the
Uh-huh.
Washington Post, and they have a page that's like 5 myths about blank debunked.
Yeah.
And then you read it, and it's like myth, fact. But the fact they put in contrast to myth is almost always actually an opinion.
Of
And even
course.
when they put some
Right.
facts in the opinion, it's actually a very decontextualized set of facts. And so, like, just routinely, when I know something about the topic, I'm just like, that's actually not even directionally true.
Right.
And this is true of a lot of fact checking. Is there's clearly a lot of spin on the ball and a lot of fact checking. So I think that's another thing that I just, like we could talk about that in the hair no, I think it was it the Harris the second like the JD Vance Wallace debate. I can't remember. There was one where the fact checking was no, I think it was the Harris Trump debate where there was no fact checking, whereas in the
Oh, right.
previous debate
Right.
there had been fact checking. Yeah. And unambiguously, they fact checked Harris. I mean, Trump much more than Harris. Like,
Sure.
I'll put my cards on the table. I was very much a Harris voter. Like, I'm not
Uh-huh.
going to shy away from that at all. I really am feeling a lot of grief about this election.
Yeah,
But
sure.
it was just unambiguous that to the degree they were fact checking, they were fact checking her and not him and not her. And second of all, that the fact checking they were doing was often not just a straight fact check, but also like a little bit of editorializing or a little bit of
Sure.
spin on the ball.
Right, right.
And so I think there's a reason why fact checking is not particularly effective if you don't feel that there's some objective source of facts, which these days nobody does. That's one
Right.
of the things that's gone by the wayside is that trust in objective facts because
Yeah.
of trust in objective facts means trust in objective truth tellers and who are not on a side, and people just don't have that anymore.
Right.
And then lastly, I would just say when you talk to regular people, not people who are in the political class, not people who are in the highly engaged, highly
Right.
you just hear what they say. None of this filters down to them. None of
Right.
it. Yeah,
Right.
like a thing I really want to just challenge every listener on this podcast who wants to get the election. They want to understand what this election is about. Is just go talk to a collection of 5 working class people that you don't know personally and just ask them, so what do you think about the election in the most open-ended way you can?
Yeah.
And what I have found is that the kind of things that people said were just like, I mean, over and over again, I heard two or three things.
Hmm.
And I'm hearing it again. And by the way, I'm hearing them overwhelmingly from people of color, including men and women of color. Okay.
Hmm.
Working class people, Uber drivers, behind the counter, delivery people,
Yeah.
construction workers, just asking random people. I'm kind of outgoing, so
Uh-huh. Yeah,
but
yeah.
I hear things were better under Trump. My grocery cart is twice as much as it was. Um, there's all these wars in the world, and like I don't know, like it just seems like it was better before. Like I also hear I didn't like either of them. I don't, yeah, he's kind of a crook, which a lot of people just straightforwardly say. They'll say, oh, he's kind of a crook or something like that. But I don't really know what she stands for. Like
Yeah.
she sounded like a robot. These are kind of messages I heard all the time. And I've also heard plenty of working class people, including working class people of color, say, I'm really sad. Oh, this is terrible. I don't know what's going to happen. And I've
Yeah,
also heard
sure.
people say, I'm kind of glad Trump won. And like oftentimes those people have more conservative social positions, like
Sure.
all this stuff about, oh, gay people or trans people, like, that people just straightforwardly say that. And you're like, oh, okay, that is a reason, yeah. So there's a spectrum of reasons,
Right.
but none of the stuff that most of the political class is talking about is at all penetrating to everyday people, just like what they're talking about. This is
Of
not,
course not. Right. I
okay?
mean, it's this kind of divide that
Yeah.
goes on. I remember having a conversation with somebody, I don't know who it was. And we were talking about the sense that, there's those of us who are very engaged. Um,
Hmm.
to the point where we have a difficult time understanding how someone could not get information,
Hmm.
right? Because there's so much of it. And it just like overwhelm. It's like standing at the base of Hoover Dam and it blows open on you. Like, how do you avoid that?
Hmm.
I find myself, that's my world, is how could you possibly go through and not have all of this information? The concept of an undecided voter, oftentimes I'm like, how did you were you asleep for the last 2 years? Like there has been a lot of stuff, and how do you possibly avoid it? But yet that's the reality, is there's a lot of people who just it's not their priority. They're not tuned in, uh, for any number of reasons. And so then there, and you got a lot of folks who don't travel. They don't have an interest, or they can't, or whatever the case may be. They're in their everyday lives, and that's what they're doing. And so then it becomes, to me, when I hear people complain about the economy, I'm always like, people don't have any sense of what economy actually is. They're
Hmm.
actually talking about their own checking account.
Hmm.
That's what they're talking about. They're not talking about the economy, because they don't. Most people, I don't, including me, cannot tell you about the economy.
Yeah, it's like tell me about the stars in the galaxy. It's
Yeah,
like,
right.
I see this little.
Like, right. I mean, like, most of us have no concept of, yeah, we know that, oh, there's an economy, but we can't tell you about like GDP and all this other stuff. Most people can't even name what that is, let alone what the impact, and then how trade works, and all of that type of stuff. So it's not actually. So this kind of gets into something else, which I'm fond of talking about, which is, we're all using the same language,
Hmm.
oftentimes, but we're not using the same definition of words.
Hmm.
Right. I mean, this is the idea of, I think probably the best example has to do with either liberty or freedom.
Hmm.
Right. I have an idea of what freedom means. And freedom is kind of, this idea of I can do what I want within within boundaries and reasonable type of things, as long as it's not harming someone else. That's a very general, simple, basic definition. But then there are other people that freedom means, I'm right, therefore I have the freedom to impose on you in order to get for you to get it right. That type of thing, right? But we're both using the same word of freedom, but we're not communicating. We're not communicating because we're not sharing the same definitions of things. And so this kind of is a good segue into depolarization. which you have an extensive background in. And so I want to talk about a little bit about depolarization. First of all, there's again, since we were just talking about definitions, how would you define the term depolarization, and and why is it important? Why would you say it's important?
Okay, well, first off, um, depolarization actually just even among people who are in the field has many different definitions.
Yep.
And so let me distinguish between two kinds of depolarization that I think are very importantly different. One
Okay.
kind is policy polarization. Well, let's talk about depolarization is reducing polarization. So we have to understand what polarization is. Policy polarization means the policy positions of the two parties are getting further and further apart. Okay. And that is clearly something that's just been going on for at least 30 years. Um, that is that is not necessarily a bad thing. Clear
Mm-hmm.
choices, disagreement, et cetera, et cetera. But there's another thing that is what people sometimes refer to as affective polarization, emotional polarization. And what that is not just that people have strongly different or far apart policy opinions, but it's when you actually hate the other side, see the other
Right.
side as a threat, see the other side as an enemy. You find them disgusting, you disdain them. And so this emotional polarization where we are more hostile towards the other side, less seeing them as good people who disagree with us or average people who disagree with us, um, and more seeing them as enemies, demons. I think polarization in that sense has a lot to do with demonization. And
Would
so
would
the kind of
would you
depolarization.
would you
So
say that that also then gets into the sense of identity and how we identify ourselves, and so it gets into a very core sense of being? Would you say that's a fair way to put
yeah,
it?
definitely like that. There's basically people use the word tribalism, and so
Right.
my tribe and your tribe, and the people in my tribe are all good, and the people in your tribe are all bad, and tribalism being defined on these ideological lines. So if you identify as conservative or right wing, you're like people who are liberal or progressive are bad, and if you identify as progressive or liberal, people who are conservative or right wing are bad people. I mean, there's a lot to say about that, but I think that identity-based sense of ideology that has a hostility to somebody who's ideologically different from you is something that has been growing rapidly over the past actually 30 years, and it is something that I think has really really created a lot of toxicity in politics, and actually ironically drive some of the things that the people on both sides are most concerned about. I mean, most notably the conservative critique of the sort of direction of progressive social justice ideology, the thing that's attacked as woke. Um,
Mm-hmm.
that movement, I think, is very much driven reactionarily against a perception of this of the way in which the conservative ideology is so hostile to all these groups of people, and likewise what is attacked by progressives as reactionary, as sort of racist or xenophobic, or the various different labels that they get applied. So much of the sentiments which are in that movement are often driven by a sense uh, of progressivism, or the thing that they call woke being hostile to treating them like crap, and so then it's sort of it's this kind of downward spiral of,
Right.
by fighting the other side, you're actually making the other side dig their heels in more,
Right.
and the phenomenon is increasing. So depolarization, coming back to your starting question, of the sort that I care about and that I think is important, is decreasing the degree to which we hate or view as enemies people with whom we disagree.
Yeah.
And so that's the first part of the question. Your second part is, why is that important? There's a lot of reasons why I think that's important, but I'll give you at least two, that one personal and one systemic. Personally, polarization has had huge negative impacts on my life.
Mm.
And most people I talk to have had something similar experiences. You lose
Yeah.
friends,
Yeah.
you become alienated from family members. There are spaces you no longer want to go to, or that you no longer feel like if you go to, you'll be welcome in.
Yeah.
There's just a very high personal cost to this. And I'll tell you that, I had a pivot in my career when I turned from education, which was my entire career for almost 20 years, away and towards depolarization, faith-based political advocacy, these kinds of things. And that pivot largely had to do with polarization eating the education reform movement alive.
Mm.
There was a 20-year period or more, maybe 30, um, of left and right people working together on education reform. Well, you had a
Hmm.
lot of center left, center right coalitions. George W. Bush and Ted Kennedy shaking hands over the No Child
Right.
Left Behind Act.
Right.
There was a totally different spirit, and there was always disagreements, but there was some shared base of wanting to improve education for all groups of students that was quite politically popular, broadly politically popular.
Yeah.
And in the era right around when Trump came to office, 2016, though I don't think you could easily say it was due to him,
Right.
certainly happened at the same time, and I would argue he inflamed it, but the space started eating itself alive. And the conservatives and the progressives started not even being willing to be in the same rooms. The coalitional space broke down. The issues that people were focused on totally shifted, so that right wingers were focused on their critiques of quote unquote critical race theory. Left wingers were focused on teaching social justice in the classroom as they perceived it. And fights over how that was going to play out became like really big in the space. And then later on, very mystifyingly to me, um, the COVID became a very polarized issue, and
Right.
I chuckled to myself because it's hard to imagine 10 years ago a pandemic being a polarized issue, but it became very polarized. Whether you want to wear
Right.
masks in school, whether you
Right.
want to have a virtual school or not, this was like somehow an ideological battle now, as opposed to a practical thing. And the questions that I cared about education about, the reasons I was motivated from it, that had to do with my own personal background, quality education for all students, especially those with the least advantages in society, that was just off the table. Nobody's paying attention to quality education. And by the way, the quality of education has fallen off a cliff since the pandemic. Like, I
Yep.
mean,
Right.
the pandemic did so much damage to that we are not at all reckoning with. But instead, we're arguing about
Right.
whether about bathrooms, and we're arguing about the teaching of the history of race, and we're arguing about whether you can say certain words or read certain books, like these kind of things. Which is not to say there's nothing to the arguments, but you know, to me, the reason we send our kids to school is primarily so that they can learn something,
Right.
and be safe by that matter.
Yeah.
And so like seeing that in my own personal life in this space that I'd spent my whole career in, and also just feeling that it wasn't just the polarization across ideological lines, it was within ideological lines.
Yeah.
The hostility that happened between people who were in one place on the left and who were another place on the left, between people who were in
Hmm.
one place on the right and people who were another place on the right, and the sort of like ease with which you could get kicked out of the tribe if
Oh
you
yeah.
became very intense and very nasty. And I felt like there was a rot underneath our social fabric that I had to attend to. And so that's on a personal level how it came to me. And then in terms of a societal level, the government is not working. The last Congress was the least productive Congress, I believe, in decades, if not in recorded history. The conflicts that are happening are grinding the gears of governance to a halt.
Yeah.
You can't, in a country that's evenly divided, when we're still like, whether the Republicans have a trifecta or not, was it 48-50 was the last election?
Yeah.
That's that's a margin of error. When
Right.
you're within that zone, you can't govern if the other side is an enemy who must be stopped at all costs. And on your side, you have to have a view of purity and you can't have any compromise. You just can't make any progress as a
Right.
governing coalition.
Well, so
So
so I would say in response that the government is working exactly the way it was designed.
say more.
Um, because so my take on the history is that our founders did not
Mhm.
trust people, right? They didn't trust the king, that's for sure. And they
Mhm.
didn't trust that people would be doing the best thing. There's a lot of self-interest and all this type of stuff, and so they created a system of government that was not efficient.
Mhm.
And that, right, this goes back to the Federalist Papers and all this type of stuff of you have to be really careful with factions, right? James
Mhm.
Madison, one of the Federalist Papers, I think number 10, I don't remember, factions, right? And so a very big concern is making sure that factions don't get their way. for the purposes of the general common good. And so government is designed to be inefficient. The most efficient forms of government are tyranny,
Hmm.
because it's whoever's in charge says it, and therefore it's the law. Democracy is messy, and it's disruptive, and it is slow, and it is inefficient, and that is not a bad thing. Um, However, I will say, while it worked the way it was supposed to, the part of that is also, it's supposed to be motivation then to figure out how we can compromise and figure out how we're going to live together and actually make some kind of progress. That part has not been working. There hasn't been enough pain, essentially, to get people to say, you know what, this whole purity test thing not working. We're not getting what we want, and we're not going to, because there's other people who have a different purity test,
Hmm.
who are just as entrenched. And
Hmm.
we're, like, when words fail, bullets start to fly, type of thing, right? So in one sense, I think there is a section of it that is working the way it's supposed to, but it's not causing, like, people are not seeing that, oh, this should be a wake up call for, we should take a different approach, that so that we can get some things done, and we need to move away from all of that. I'm wondering too. There's a couple of books, as you're talking about some things. There's a couple of books that are coming to mind.
Hmm.
One is Why We're Polarized by Ezra Klein. I don't know
Hmm.
if you read that.
Oh yeah, definitely. It's
Yeah,
a really really excellent diagnosis, though
yeah,
ironically from a left perspective,
sure.
kind of unavoidably he's a left thinker, but very honest left thinker. So.
Yeah, yeah. The other two books that came to my mind were The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt. Really kind of getting into the deeper sense, right, of identity and all that. And the other book that kind of plays around with that is Negotiating the Non-Negotiable,
Hmm.
which again, like, that book with The Righteous Mind really gives a good sense of, let's get past the surface level to the really deeper things that
Hmm.
people care about, and what motivates them to do what they're doing in that.
That
Um,
last one is new to me. The other two I'm quite familiar with. That last one I'm interested in. Well, just because I haven't heard about it before.
yeah, sure. I highly recommend it. I've done a book review on my blog. You can search for that. People can search for that. I think last name is I think it's Kennedy. I'm not sure. I don't have it right in front of me, but
It's not Daniel Shapiro. I just Googled it
oh
while we
yeah,
were.
it's Dan Shapiro. Yes,
Dan
that's
Shapiro.
it.
Okay, got it. Yeah,
Yep,
I'm
absolutely.
absolutely gonna check that out. That's a great interest to me. I'll mention, by the way, that the book that you mentioned, Jonathan Haidt's The Righteous
Yeah,
Mind,
yeah.
is probably one of the most important books I read in the last decade.
Oh
Like,
yeah,
yeah,
I would agree with that. I mean that.
yeah. I go back to it over and over again and think about it so much so in trying to understand not just the political divide, but also cultural divides, which is
Yeah,
a big part of, as I mentioned, my family comes from two different cultures. So
right,
that's a place where you can start to understand what's going on in culture much better when you see these different moral taste buds he talks about.
right. There's another book, and I'm just looking it up. Richard Slotkin just did this, A Great Disorder, and
Hmm. What's that one about?
it's about national myth and the battle for
Hmm.
America. So he talks about five national myths that
Hmm.
really kind of shape our discourse and policy. Um, Again, it kind of goes along with all the things that we're talking about. Highly recommend it. I mean, it really taps into what are the myths that we use and we talk about, regardless of how true those myths are. Of course, there's elements of truth in myths, but those shape so much. These are things that can really kind of form a nation. Pretty much is the idea with that. So we got about 10 minutes left, which,
Yeah, and
I'm like,
I
psh,
have to apologize, by the way, Matthew.
yeah,
This is the first public appearance I've had since the election, so I think I
it's
just
all
talked
right.
way too much because
No, no, no.
I
It's It's good. This is exactly the type of thing. I'm glad that you were able to come on and just kind of like, I need to unload all of this stuff that I've been holding inside.
We just
But
think about this so much, and it's affecting you, and there's not a lot of space for
yeah,
kind of honest processing, you know?
right. Absolutely. So this is great. So with the limited time we have, I want to go back to something that you were talking about, is that this kind of personal cost.
Hmm.
I see people, especially on social media, talk about, or in conversations, talk about how they just can't anymore. They just can't, be connected to somebody on social media. They just can't, like, there's people who are like, no Thanksgiving this year, or whatever the case may be. And I get that to some degree. There are people
Hmm.
that I have certainly cut off because it was not in a healthy way. Like I
Hmm.
I am connected to people who I disagree with, and that's fine. That's great. But it's kind of like you were talking about, that kind of polarization. I'm registered nonpartisan. I don't have an interest in promoting either political party. I don't have a whole lot of trust of political parties. I've worked in one. So that's where that comes from. But
Get another podcast interested to hear that
yeah,
story.
right. But there are people who I disagree with, that I can have conversations, and we can talk about policy and all that type of stuff, because they're not seeing me in a dehumanizing way, and I'm not seeing them in a dehumanizing way. But there are people that it's like, whoa, like, okay, I need to kind of protect myself
Hmm.
from that, but not in a way that I'm going to then turn around and do the same thing of dehumanize and
Mm.
all that type of stuff. I'm just wondering, thoughts on, how do people create a space where they can, I don't know what even the words are, that they can feel valued or safe, or whatever the case may be, still be in relationship with, how do people discern who to be in relationship with, especially
Mm.
when they have differences?
Mm.
Yeah,
There's a lot in that question, so let me
yeah,
try and take a couple pieces. We haven't talked about it very much except in the intro, but yours is I believe a faith-focused podcast.
yeah,
And I know you're a pastor.
yeah.
My wife is a pastor, and I work for a church. And we haven't talked much directly about
Right.
faith and the faith connection here.
Well, we
But
got
for me,
7 minutes. Woo.
well, I'll tell you, this is at the heart of it for me.
Yeah,
I do believe in depolarization from a sort of practical lens and from a
yeah,
relational lens, but I believe it also in it from a faith lens.
yeah,
And the reason I believe in it from a faith lens, and I feel very passionate about it from a faith lens, is because it strikes me as the core of the gospel.
yeah.
Um, Jesus taught us to love our enemies and pray for those who persecute us. Okay.
Right,
And to be explicit, he was persecuted unto death.
right,
So he's not talking about somebody who calls your group, you know,
right.
um,
Whatever names. Right,
yeah, he's talking about somebody who will torture you to death on a cross.
right.
And many of his closest followers did take that to heart and followed that to that kind of death.
Yeah,
And so, there was a quote that somebody put out. I'm about to quit Twitter, and so if you're breaking relationships on social media, the one I would really encourage you to break is your relationship with social media as a whole. um,
yeah,
but nonetheless, there was a quote on Twitter that did actually move me, and it summarized a sentiment that is at the heart of mine. If Jesus could forgive those who crucified him on a cross, I can forgive a person who voted and thinks differently than me.
yeah,
If Jesus could break bread with the person who would betray him, turn him over to be tortured and killed, and still serve him a piece of bread, and by the way, he washed Judas's feet too.
yeah. Right,
If Jesus can do that, I can break bread at Thanksgiving with my uncle who voted the opposite way from me.
right, right,
And so, from a profound faith-based level, if we say, no, it's not possible, it's not feasible for me, I just ask us, what do you think the gospel's about? And
right.
so that's not to say that the answer to how is easy.
Yeah, right.
And I mean, among my friends who vote a different way from me or think differently than me, the ones where it's harder are the ones who there's a difference in values that plays out in interpersonal interaction. Like,
Yeah.
I have a friend who, like I said, I voted at Harris. He's been a decade or more friend. He voted Trump, at least the last time. I don't know if he did this time, but and he um he has kind of a bro culture, and he would often make derogatory jokes about my wife,
Yeah.
that were related to sort of like me, whether I'm a real man and whether I'm in charge of my household, and
Sure.
that's not my vision of my household.
Right. Right.
Um, and that became really hard for me.
Yeah.
Um, and I haven't cut him off, but I told him, like, listen, man, like, you can't talk about my wife that way, and you can't,
Yeah.
like, that's not okay. Like, and if he can honor that and say, okay, I'm backing off on that point because that's really just rubbing you the wrong way, then I'm not going to say I can't be friends with you. Like,
Right.
but other friends, like I have more than one friend who worked in the Trump administration, and I'm very passionately on the other side of that
Yeah.
political
Yeah.
aisle. And I can maintain that friendship, and I can tell them what I think, and they can tell me what they think. And actually, relationship is one of the only ways is that people really change their minds about anything.
Right. Right.
So
Because if social media worked the way that we've been told that it was, then gosh, a whole lot of people would be changing their minds based on memes. Right.
yeah, I this is a whole other podcast, but I literally believe that the best thing you can do for your mental health is quit all social media and stop looking at digital news.
Yeah.
Now, you want to read the news? Get a paper, get a physical
Right.
paper or a magazine.
Right. Because
But like, stay off digital news, get
oh
rid of all
yeah.
social media. Your mental health will jump up right away. So,
Well, I will tell you, on my own personal end, since the election, I have not gone to any digital media for news. It's not that I'm uninformed. I hear plenty. I don't need to, but I will tell you, I'm in a much better mental and emotional health. Same thing. I have not gone and watched even any clips of late night shows
mm,
because I think it's kind of in the same realm
mhm.
of the news media. Yeah. So I miss out on some funny jokes and all that, but I think there's a whole lot of demeaning that goes on.
Yeah.
Right. This is that whole us and them type of thing
Hmm.
going on.
Disdain and yeah.
Right, right. So okay, we got 2 minutes left. So Silas, is there any other bits of wisdom in about 1 minute that you would like to that is so essential that the audience needs to hear about anything that we've talked about?
Well, I know I talk fast, so let's see what I can get done.
All right, you got like 50 seconds.
Uh, in all seriousness, I would say to my friends on the right, if you think this election confirmed that the country is with you and that there's going to be a new multiracial coalition on the right, look at the margins, look at what people seem to be voting about, and ask yourself if the narrative that's being put forward is one that really works for everybody there. To my friends on the left, if you think this election confirms that America is hopelessly racist, sexist, xenophobic, etc., pay attention to the shifts among people of color, and then go talk to some non-metropolitan people of color who are working class. Just spend some time talking to people like that and see what you hear.
Mm,
And to all people, I would encourage you, particularly if you're a Christian, to think about the cost of polarization in your life and to ask yourself how you might pursue your political hopes and dreams in a way that does not shred the fabric of relationship and civic life in the country. So that's my three closing thoughts.
perfect. Thank you so much. You have the last say on all of this. So I'm so very glad that you took some time to come on to the show. It's my first show post election, and I feel like this was a really rich conversation talking about things that I think I know they've been on my mind, and I think you've really been very helpful, at least for me, and hopefully for the audience as well. So thank you very much, Silas.
It's been a pleasure. I look forward to talking again, Matthew.
All right. Thanks.
Bye
And
bye.
everyone, have a great day.